Dear students, welcome to this week's class. We talk about authoritarianism, authoritarian regimes, which is also, alongside democracy, an important topic in comparative politics. The questions that most scholars are interested in are what are the different types of non-democratic regimes? They're just like they are different types of democracies, they are also different variations between authoritarian regimes. And how are they maintained? Because, well, most people would agree that authoritarianism is not a desirable political regime, although some would advocate that it's actually a, efficient way to govern societies. But most people would actually aim for living in a more democratic country that respects human rights and that has some form of plurality. But if this is a desirable goal, then why are authoritarian countries still around? Well, authoritarian regimes still around. So we'll try to answer that. And finally, what brings democratic change? Just like countries can democratize, but they can also fall back into authoritarianism. There are many examples in history of military regimes switching from democracy to authoritarianism. Nigeria, more recently Myanmar is a good example of that, among many others. So what do we qualify as authoritarian regimes? So these are countries where a limited number of individuals exercise power over the state. The government is not constitutionally responsible to the public. The first point actually is well, you could say typical of authoritarian regimes, but at the same time, you could say that in many democratic countries, there's also a limited number of individuals, right? So the government exercises power over the state. The difference is that usually the government is constitutionally responsible, and if people are really displeased with this government, they have the possibility to change, to remove this government and put someone else in charge. But that's not really the case in authoritarian regimes. That the government can get away with a lot of things without fearing to be removed from power. Because individual freedom is restricted, right? There's the rule of law might be there on paper, but in reality it's not implemented. And there are restrictions about plurality, political plurality. Opposition is difficult to organize, and even individual actions such as protests, for instance. These are more collective actions, but freedom of speech is restricted. The fourth point is that often most countries of the world have constitutions that will announce that they respect democracy, right, and freedom, but we know that's not really the case. So it's on paper, but not in reality. But some countries actually don't pretend to be democratic. So you have, for instance, Saudi Arabia. Monarchies don't pretend to be democratic. There are countries such as China and Cuba that recognize only one legitimate political actor, which is the Communist Party. So in that sense, non-democracy, the absence of plurality is actually institutionalized, right? So they don't pretend to be democracies. And one last point that we will not really discuss, but that is interesting to know, is that they can be intranational unequal democratization. So that's the case in very large countries that might be more decentralized, such as federations, where there are regional parliaments, for instance. The case of Mexico, Brazil are quite interesting, where you have some regional pockets of authoritarianism. Or the opposite can also be true. You can have states in India, for instance. India is a very large country, very populous country, where you can have states that are functioning very well, where democratic rules are functioning, are implemented and respected, and others where there's more corruption, there's less political competition, for instance. So that's quite interesting for large countries to see variations between regions. The case of Canada is quite interesting as well. If you take Alberta, for instance, Alberta is a province in the west of Kazakhstan that is oil rich. And for 3 or 4 decades, the same party governed the province. So I'm not saying that they were an authoritarian party, but there was very little political pluralism, for instance. So somebody made parallels with oil dependency and absence of political plurality. So that's interesting, just to keep that in mind. This is a map. This is from the Economist Intelligence Unit. One of the indicators, one of the maps and sort of index. There are different indexes out there, but this is the one I chose because it shows more nuances. So green, the green color indicates more democracy. Full democracy. You see, for instance, what is interesting is that the United States is not considered a completely full democracy, and you might wonder why, because they are always criticizing others for breaching democratic principles. But the reason is because of the cost of political campaigns in the United States. Politics is very driven by financial interests in the United States, which is a contrast with other countries such as, well, Canada, where it's very difficult to financially influence one political party because individual donations are limited. It depends on the province, but it's limited to sometimes to $100. So yeah, there's no way you can actually influence a political party with $100. But in the case, it's unrestricted in the United States. So that's one problem that makes this country a bit less democratic in that sense, because politics is for the rich, basically, in simple terms. So you see, well, Central Asia, lots of red over there, and parts of Africa as well. So post-colonial world, well, Russia is not post-colonial, but yeah, so post-communist world is more or less, is not, resolutely not very democratic. Others, like I said, Saudi Arabia does not even pretend to be democratic, etc. So these are just the indicators they look at. Some of them we might criticize because they are hard to measure, such as the functioning of government. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly how they measure that. Political culture, which they define as passivity, docile citizens. So again, it's a bit difficult to measure that. Political participation is more straightforward, but at the same time, participation can be very high. Like in Kazakhstan, for instance, the participation rates at elections are quite high, but at the same time there is no plurality. So it doesn't, because you have political participation in the elections, doesn't mean that elections are more democratic. If there is no one, there are no serious candidates outside the ruling party, for instance. What are the source of non-democratic rule? So what actually fuels authoritarian politics? Modernization, which could be a bit outdated factor here. This was more relevant, I would say, during the moment of independences. I'm using the plural form of that because I'm referring to the 60s and the 70s, where a lot of post-colonial countries gained independence from their former colonial powers. And the change and the modernization process that they went through was actually so disturbing that it led to the implementation of authoritarian rule, just sort of to keep order. And that's always an argument that autocrats will use to justify their authoritarian politics, because they say we need we don't need democracy, because democracy is too destabilizing for the period what we are going through right now, right? So modernization requires strong leaders, strong politics, but that certainly can be a factor. But again, it's in 2021 a bit of an outdated argument. Elites. I mentioned that earlier in the semester, that elites are very significant. Well, for a number of reasons, right? So you can have political elites, you can have intellectual elites, cultural ones, but here we're talking about political elites. And political elites, usually when we talk about that, we refer to national ones, right? But there can be different sorts of elites, such as local elites. I'm sure you know who are your local elites in your own regions and cities and neighborhoods. But elites are powerful because they normally hold political power, so power to make decisions. And in many authoritarian countries, they also hold economic power. So there's a strong connection between the economic sector and the political sector. So elites often have political and financial power, and their decisions and their interests will greatly influence politics. And elites can actually decide, see for themselves that democracy would be more beneficial for them. You have that, let's take the French Revolution, right? So the elite, the very old elite, was the royalty, right? So member of the royal family and all the counts and countesses, etc., right? But there was a new elite emerging, the bourgeoisie, right? So, and for them, the old system, the monarchical system, was not beneficial to them. It was beneficial to the old elites. So the new elites, for them, democracy, the democratization of political space and of the sort of growing industrialization, the economy, was beneficial for them. So elites are not always against democracy. They are in favor of the system that will favor them the most. And then we have society culture, which is a bit of a slippery argument, because it can lead to some racist claims about different cultures. Like Samuel Huntington, for instance, was saying that in his book, The Clash of Civilizations, that some cultures are more prone to democracy than others, and that in particular Confucianists, in Eastern cultures and Islamic cultures are less likely to hold democratic ideals. But I think I mentioned in the previous PowerPoint as well that the opposite can also be true. Some cultures are more prone to democratization, but not necessarily because of their habits or core values, but just because the way society is organized. If you remember Putnam, with horizontal ties. So, but that can definitely be something that we want to consider when we talk about vertical of power and sort of patrimonial relations that are inherent to some societies, that sort of are reflected at the political level as well. So respect for elders, for instance, and respect for authority in general. IR, international relations, very significant as well. This is comparative politics, but we care about what is happening in the world. If we take the example of Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan's neighbors are not democratic. Russia is not. China is not. So there is not a powerful player next to it that would probably sort of influence the political regime in Kazakhstan. There are numerous examples. South Korea, you could say, was influenced by the United States after the war. Well, the United States is imposing a lot of conditions, democratic rules all over the world when it suits them, of course, not always. They're a bit picky about who they want to impose democracy on. But international relations definitely have a great impact on how, if regimes are maintained or if democratization will take place. Kosovo is another example, for instance, right? So what are the specific tools and institutions of authoritarian rule? These are pretty straightforward. So we have coercion. Well, that's, straightforward. Violence against people. Imprisonment. Surveillance. So surveillance can be understood as some form of coercion because it prevents you from doing this and that, saying this and that. Imprisonment, violence, it can, in some cases, murder, right? So as brutal as murder. And I will show you in a moment what countries have the highest imprisonment rates. Cooptation. So cooptation refers to the idea that, all regimes, as authoritarian as it can be, they can never rely solely on violence, on coercion, because it's unsustainable. People will, at some point or not, revolt against you. Violence is not a sustainable way to manage a country, to manage a society. So you need some form of cooptation, where cooptation means that people will collaborate with you. They will get some form of benefits from agreeing to your rule. So we're talking about corporatism, where some groups are co-opted by the state, where they can receive some benefits. For instance, nepotism. Nepotism refers to strengthening ties within a close circle of people around the leader. And cooptation is easier when you have some money, some revenues. So cooptation is easy in oil-rich countries, for instance. Other countries are not necessarily, don't have the material wealth, doesn't have the material wealth to co-opt people. That's why they might rely on coercion more. Let's take North Korea, for example, which is a poor state. So they rely on coercion, as well as personality cults and ideology, right? So North Korean leaders are greatly revered, yeah. So they are greatly presented as exceptional people, even almost as if they were some magical beings, right? Which some people actually believe. So if you click on the link there, it's quite interesting to see that some of this worship almost that you see is actually genuine, but others just fake it, right? Because this is what you have to, not to get into trouble. And then there's the third one, persuasion, that Schatz and Maltseva talked to us about. So persuasion is about control of media, but not only control of media, it's not only that you will prevent people from talking about some topics, uncomfortable topics, but it's also about reframing events that don't look good for you, that are not in your favor, but it's reframing them in a way that you can actually make it look more acceptable to the public. One article about Kazakhstan, David Lewis, a British scholar, wrote a paper about the news coverage of Zhanaozen in 2014 or 11. I forgot Zhanaozen when it was, or 11, I guess. They didn't, the regime allowed people to talk about it, but they framed it in a way as if the police was restoring order, right? So the emphasis was put on restoring order and not on the violence that took place there. So that's one way of reframing, not completely ditching bad news, but reframing them. If you take Turkmenistan, for instance, right? So this is a country that is extremely on the very red scale of authoritarianism. So they would, for instance, not even mention anything, right? So there was no COVID-19 in Turkmenistan last year. It was just some kind of allergy to sandstorm, something like that. So that's the kind of control of media that doesn't involve any bad news whatsoever. But other countries might allow bad news or that make the regime look bad, but reframe it in a more favorable way. These are countries with the most prisoners, so that's quite interesting to see that the United States is the leader of all, which, well, you might argue that, but these are not political prisoners, right? They are criminals, unlike Cuba, for instance, which has a very high number of prisoner per 100,000 citizens. But at the same time, some people would argue that most prisoners in the United States are black males who are from impoverished backgrounds. So this is in itself a bit political. But overall, you see, Russia also has a high number. Turkey, Iran, China is not on the list, but this is for sure very high, as we know with the internment camps in western China and Xinjiang. Probably, one of the certainly the top at the top of the countries list, of the world's list. I wanted to talk about, this is from your book, so different types of authoritarian regimes. You have personal, there are a bunch of links here you can click. Personal and monarchical rule, where it's pretty straightforward, easy to understand. A single leader with more or less clear rules. There's a personalized leadership, so monarchical rule would be, for instance, Saudi Arabia. A personal rule, I should have written there, would be, for instance, Libya under Gaddafi. So this was a system where the rules were not very clear because the power was so personalized. Whereas Saudi Arabia has institutionalized its non-democratic status. Then you have hybrid illiberal regimes that are sort of in between, because they don't, they will not straightforward say that they are not democratic, right? There is an elected leadership, right? So they are regular elections, but the procedures are flawed. There's manipulation, harassment of opposition, and in general, the opposition is not very strong and will never be. Or there actually isn't any opposition anymore. So I'll give you a few examples. Central Asia is a good example of that. Countries of Central Asia. You have the one-party rule. So often students would have a tendency to classify Kazakhstan as one-party rule because there is one party that dominates the entire political system. But it's not the case. When we talk about, so Kazakhstan would be more a hybrid regime. One-party rule means that other groups are actually banned, right? So this is the case in China and Cuba. I mean, their constitutions don't say that other parties are banned, but they recognize the primary role of the Communist Party in their constitution. So the Communist Party is the only one that is legitimate. So that's the difference, right? So it's institutionalized in that case. The one-party rule is institutionalized. It's not in Tajikistan, it's not in Kazakhstan. Military rule, also pretty straightforward, often brought to power through a coup. We thought that these were over, these were things of the 60s and the 70s, but recent news in Myanmar, right, brought it in the spotlight again, that armed forces, the army, is actually in power, right? They're actually in charge. There's no particular ideology, emphasis on stability. And then you have the theocracy, so rule of law based on religious texts, where religious leadership is fused with the political one. Iran is a good example of that, and normally in class I would do an actual complete week on Iran, which I find is a very interesting case of a mix of democratic institutions and theocracy, because they have a president, as you know, who is elected, and they also have a parliament. Yeah, so parliamentary politics is exists in Iran, but at the same time, the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, is also a very important political figure, and he's not elected; he's chosen. It's a bit complex. You can look up into the cases, but yeah. So it's actually a mix in Iran. I'll go very quickly on that, just to mention that there are a number of different concepts that scholars come up with. They like it. It makes them look like they have revolutionized the political science. So here we have Wei and Levitsky. They talk about competitive authoritarianism, which might sound a bit counterintuitive, but so what they mention is that there are different political parties, but they have no chance of winning the elections, because there is one party that has all the resources and all the power, right? So the democratic institutions are there, but one party monopolizes all power. That's just one example. And then we have this week's text about written by Schatz and Maltsova. They talk about soft authoritarianism, right? It sounds actually very nice. So they mention that it relies mostly on discursive efforts, right? And they try to avoid brute force. Yeah, they try to avoid blunt coercion, and that because it's more, as I mentioned, it's unsustainable to use violence on a very long-term basis. So persuasion is more efficient. It's a more efficient way to maintain your regime, to keep stability. But persuasion also implies some form of compliance from the population, right? So because they see some benefit. So here, persuasion can be a synonym of persuasion here could be cooptation. Yeah, so people receive some benefits and they agree to abide by the rules decided by the rulers. But in a long-term basis, persuasion is likely to fail if there is a very big gap between what is advertised by the regime and how people actually live, right? So if there is too big of a distance between what the regime is saying they're doing and what they are actually doing, so that's in the long term, it can be persuasion can become inefficient as well. This is just an example of not an example, but the timeline of Kazakhstan's transition from at the time it became independent until now. It's from Sally Cummings, 2005, so that's quite interesting to see that in the early 1990s, there was actually some political competition going on. And even the parliament in 1994 and 1995, they opposed the President Nazarbayev, over the nomination of one prime minister, because this prime minister was very much in favor of privatization. And the parliament opposed the president and asked for the prime minister to be dismissed. So I I just want you to think about if this could possibly happen in 2021, where the parliament would go against the decisions of the president. So, but this happened in 1990, so that's quite interesting. Kazakhstan was a semi-presidential system at the early 1990s, and then it became a presidential system. Parliamentarism was dismissed because Nazarbayev claimed that Kazakhstanis were not ready for that, this kind of plural politics, among other things. 1995, 1998, we have centralization, privatization happened despite some people were opposed to it. You have some intra-elite fragmentation, and in 2005, monopolization of power, from 2005 and on until today, monopolization of power. So you can see this from this book, quite interesting, and this transition timeline also relies on David Siegel's piece on constitutional changes. And here are some of the constitutional amendments that are a bit problematic in terms of democracy. So there is immunity for the first president of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Immunity is something common that you see in constitutions all around the world. For instance, in France, in Italy, you cannot be prosecuted when you are in position, when you are in power. So when you're still holding your political position, but as soon as you are no longer in position, then you can be held liable for your presidency, for instance, or in the case of France, you can see many politicians were trialed after they left their positions. So Sarkozy is in trouble now. He's in court for abuse of power. Other problematic elements are banking secrecy. Yeah, so this is Article 3 of the Constitution. That banking secrecy for the president and his family. So this is quite unusual to find this in constitutions around the world. It would be interesting to see if there are actually other constitutions that specifically mention that. Maybe other Central Asian countries, I'm not sure. Constitutional amendments were adopted again in 2017, where it was meant to expand the powers of the Constitutional Council. So this body could review the constitutionality of laws in force. So, but at the same time, the idea was to strengthen the parliament's supervisory powers over the activities of the government. But as we know, the balance of power is very much in favor of the president until now, even after there was a change in the presidency. So the constitution didn't really make the president more accountable to other branches of government. So you can have a look at those amendments. It's online. This one is in English, but you have a Kazakh and Russian version as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about Tajikistan, where you have a mix of cult of personality, nepotism, and blunt coercion. Unfortunately, not so much co-optation. So these are pictures I took in Tajikistan. The one at the bottom is a bit old, from 2010. So he's so Rohun. This is a dam that they built to provide more power, hydroelectric power to Kazakhstan. So we see here strongly they're determined to bring more electricity for his people, and the other one in the top corner is fairly new, from 2017. I think I took this picture. I went to Tajikistan the last time. And it says, the president, our pride. So this is really straightforward, that there's a strong cult of personality going on. And those pictures you can see on every second building, right? So I think it's a bit of a contrast with Kazakhstan, where you see some pictures of the president, but not that often. Nepotism, so Emomali Rahman, who has been in power since 1992 now, he has a lot of children. He has 9 children, and as you can see, also many grandchildren. And all his family members are involved in the government or in the financial sector in some capacities. On the right, you can see that's his son, Rustem Emomali, who was he tried to get a degree from some university in Russia, but failed. So he's a graduate of university in Tajikistan, and he was the head of the national sports organization, something like that, association. And he was later named mayor of Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan. And afterwards, he was actually named the head of parliament recently. That's in 2019, I think. Chairman of the National Assembly in Kazakhstan. So these are other examples. Ozoda, his daughter, was deputy minister of foreign affairs, and now she's the head of the administration. Her husband is the first deputy head of the National Bank of Tajikistan. So you get the portrait. And then finally, you have this guy who is his grandson. He's an adult. This is a picture taken in Dubai. So he has a very luxurious life in Dubai. Ismail Sohibov, also a graduate of Tajikistan National University, and also works at the National Bank. And at the same time, so there's a lot of nepotism going on, as you can see, but there's also a lot of coercion. This is something that I studied extensively in my research, in my past research, in my doctoral research, actually. Especially the dismantlement of the Islamic Revival Party of Tajikistan, which was the only Islamic party of all Central Asia, the only legal one, I should mention. In 2015, so they were just banned completely, and a lot of members went into exile, and others ended up in prison for the rest of their lives, for 25 years, because they were accused of terrorism, which was very dubious claims that they tried to organize some terrorist attack. I don't have time to enter into details, but serious doubts about that. So there was mass imprisonment and extrajudicial killings, even of opposition members outside Kazakhstan. So that's quite interesting. Recently, in 2020, this 87-year-old man was jailed for providing food to prisoners' families. So the political prisoners, he was just going around providing them food to the families, not even to the prisoners, and he was himself imprisoned. So you can see to what extent they go, how far the regime goes to silence opposition leaders. Finally, I want to mention this book, quite provocative book, written by two scholars, American Alexander Cooley and John Heddershaw, who is British. Very interesting book talking about money laundering from Central Asia to the rest of the world, and how a lot of those flows of money is actually enabled by foreign banks, including Western banks, where and they sort of highlight the contradiction and hypocrisy of some Western governments that allow those flows of money without questioning their provenance, their sources. And the case of Kazakhstan is also mentioned, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan as well. So it's available at the library if you're interested. I'll stop here and I'll see you next week.